Well, first, let me just appreciate you, Kristen and Eric, for the work you do. Hope on the Hard Road. I love, love, love talking about it, talking about the resources that you have available, and pointing people to your website. So thank you so much for the work. My name is Gina Plate, and I oversee special education and legislative and regulatory affairs for the California Charter Schools Association. And we are a member organization of the 1,300 charters in California. And I also, for the last 8 years, have chaired the Advisory Commission on Special Ed for the state. And so that's just an advisory body that informs the legislature, the state board, and the Department of Ed on education issues. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go through, first of all, some funding priorities, and then talk about a study that you may be interested in, because of course, folks in Sacramento are not always interested in hearing from policy people. They want to hear from parents. And so I'm going to give you a couple ways to engage, and then talk about some pieces of legislation that are coming up and you might want to get involved in. So first of all, in 2019, our governor, who does have dyslexia and has kids with dyslexia, said that one of the most important things in his budget in that year was revamping our special ed funding and services structure. And so he put a lot of money into what he said was going to be a 3-year reform of special ed funding and services. So, and then COVID hit, but he went ahead and the money started flowing anyway. And one of the things he did right out of the gate was to put some programs or some working groups together to say, I want to understand, and you'll see the second bullet on the slide, I want to understand our current system, how it contributes to providing the right amount of funding to the right agencies so they can provide the right services to the right students. And so I got really excited about that because our current system is census-based, which means the funding is the same for every child in a school district or a charter school. There's not more money for kids that have maybe some more expensive services. So the fact that he was looking to think differently about how services and money was allocated is really exciting. The study is being put together. We're in year 2 of the 3-year reform. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that the folks at West Ed, which is one of the organizations that was contracted to put this study together, says that in any study of special ed funding, we have to start with a shared understanding of desired outcomes. And so on the left-hand side, you see what our state is focused on right now for outcomes. But I'm going to tell you what's really actually the most important is what you and your family determine to be the post-secondary plan for your child. So if you assume that K-12 is the training ground for your kids, what is it that you want them to experience as they're going through K-12 so that they're prepared for that next step as they transition into life? This is a graph that I thought was interesting. And you've heard talk about, the census or the numbers in California nationwide are going down, but you'll see on this grid shows us that actually the numbers of kids identified as having a disability is going up very dramatically. And it's not just kids with disabilities, it's kids with mostly identified as specific learning disability, but that dramatic increase in kids that are being identified is something we have to be thinking about as we talk about redoing or revamping our system. And this was a breakdown, sort of a quick breakdown of the various handicapping conditions that exist in California. And as we think about funding, this shows us who the kids are, or at least how they are categorized for funding purposes. But what's interesting, and when we get to the Q&A part, I'll be interested in hearing the kids and the kids that you have and the services that they're receiving, how those are delivered. Are your kids able to participate in the general ed classroom, or are all the services delivered separately? And our state has made a very deliberate move towards putting kids into the general ed classes where teachers are trained on instruction, but that ends up being a more costly way to do it. And so some of the districts and charters have been a little bit slow to make those moves. And so I'll be interested in hearing if that's something that you're interested in doing, and how your kids' school is handling that. All right. And then this is an interesting graph. It shows, as our federal law says that kids should be served in the least restrictive environment, which means they should be in general ed in the classroom, if that's what you and your family want, with the supports and services pushed into that classroom in a way that makes sense. You can't just put the kid in without being completely wrapped in the appropriate supports and services. But this graph shows us the handicapping conditions in California along the left-hand side. And then the green part of the graph shows those kids with disabilities that spend 80% or more of their day with supports in the general ed classroom. And then the dark blue is between 40 and 79% of their day. And then blue, 40% of their day is in some sort of separate classroom. So it's interesting to think about as we're moving all kids, or thinking about all kids, regardless of what their needs are, into a general ed setting, what that might look like. And like I said, from a policy standpoint, research has shown that kids that spend the majority of their time in general ed have the best outcomes. But I'm really interested in hearing from you guys what your experience has been and if that's a goal for you and your family. All right, I'm going to stop there and just let you know that, like I said, we're in year 2 of this 3-year special ed funding reform. And so by the time we get through year 3, we should have a new way to fund special ed in California, which will allow you and your IEP team not to talk about money, but to be able to sit and think about what all of the services and supports are that your child needs in order to access that general ed classroom, and then have the folks that are responsible for putting that program together not be worried about what the costs are, that we'll have a structure in our state that will allow them to have access to money for those services that cost more, because it's not currently set up that way. I'm going to go ahead and move on to some legislative updates, which is, I think this is probably the most exciting part. So let me give you a little political landscape right now. And these are, the things that I talk about are not the things that you hear in the media, right? The political landscape that you hear in the media is very different than what happens on the ground every day as our state is being governed and operating. So, you'll see the top slide here, the first quarter of this legislative session. So we're in year 1 of a 2-year session. And the discussions, of course, have been consumed by what does it mean to reopen, and some very significant tension between the governor and the legislature on how and when that should happen. So you also have likely heard about a recall effort, which is consuming the governor at the moment. And they have qualified, the recall has qualified, which means they have gotten enough signatures. So you'll see that come onto the ballot later this year. Also, on top of that, we have a number of special elections that have happened already and will continue to happen as the governor has appointed folks out of the legislature into other positions. So a number of our friends in the Assembly and the Senate have been promoted or appointed to other positions. So we have open seats in the legislature that will be filled. Then the policy committee, that shakes up all the policy committees. But despite all of that, the governor has said, my commitment to special education and funding it appropriately has not changed. And so the work around special ed is one of the only things that has continued to be well funded and continuing to evolve as we look at how special ed is funded, as well as how it is governed and how decisions are made at that local level. So a lot going on in the landscape. This is an overview. I'm going to tell you about a couple of bills and how you can get involved. And so this is just a quick and dirty overview about how the legislature works. So like I said, we are in year 1 of a 2-year session. So April 30th was the deadline for the first house. Every bill starts out in the Senate or the Assembly. That's its first house, and then it will move into the second house. So bills that were introduced in the beginning of this first session had until April 30th to be introduced, and then had until May 21st to get through the first house. So it had to go to a policy committee and then a fiscal committee. And so bills that I'm about to tell you about went through Assembly Education Committee, and then are waiting for their hearing date on appropriations or the fiscal committee. And then by June 4th, there has to be a decision on whether or not the bills will move on to the second house. Once they go through the second house, then they will go to the governor for a signature. In the middle of that, we have any moment now, the May revise will come out, and that's the governor has introduced his budget back in January. We've had between January and now to go back and forth and negotiate on a number of items, mostly around the reopening of school and how to fund that and pay for all of the things that needed to be put in place in order to make that happen. And then we'll see, what his final decision is coming out in, like I said, any moment. So that's just a quick and dirty of how our process works. There are 4 bills that I want to highlight for you and then give you the opportunity to get involved. And the first one, Senate Bill 692, was introduced by Senator Cortese, and it's been re-tagged as a special ed COVID relief fund. So for all of those additional costs that came about to school districts and charter schools in order to provide services at home or virtually, or all of those additional expenses that were incurred, this fund has been proposed in order to pay for those, to reimburse districts, charter schools, and families for those services that had to be delivered differently than they were pre-COVID. So that's SB 692. It got out of the Assembly Education Committee with no opposition, no problem at all. It's headed to the Fiscal Committee in the Assembly right now. AB 967 is the COVID Special Ed Fund. SB 692 is the LRE bill. And so this bill, I talked a few minutes ago about the state and federal law requires kids to be served in the least restrictive environment. And in most cases, that means general ed with lots of supports being pushed in. Of course, there's always the option for families to say, we don't want any part of general ed. We like the separate setting. But what Senator Cortese has proposed is to make the percentage of time that kids are in general ed a publicly available data point. So your local schools, you would be able to look up and see the percentage of time that kids are integrated into a general ed classroom with supports. So it's an exciting bill. It's something that is already reported to the federal government. We're already held accountable to those percentages, but this bill would make it public and make it more transparent so that parents also knew what those percentages were. Going down to AB 126 from Assemblymember Garcia. This is increasing the number of family empowerment centers in California. So right now, family empowerment centers are in only, gosh, I think 14 areas of the state. They're resource centers for parents to get training, to get technical assistance, to get support in lots of different areas. And unfortunately, there hasn't been funding to expand them across the entire state. And so AB 126 puts a big chunk of money into replicating the current model and expanding it statewide. So even down here, you would have partners in the family empowerment centers. It actually would probably be a fantastic partner for Hope on the Hard Road. I've had really great experience with others around the state. And then AB 237 from Assemblymember Portantino has been introduced to require a dyslexia early screening. So it gives educators a tangible, easy to administer test to assess for dyslexia much earlier than currently we have available. So those are 4 bills that you have the opportunity to weigh in on. And like I said, they have gone out of the Assembly and Senate Education Committees. They're in the fiscal committees of their first house, and those hearings will happen next week. All right, so those are the 4 bills I wanted to make sure were on your radar. Talk about the process, how you might be involved.
So Gina, something that you said that seems very interesting. What I understand is there's a bill right now for charters that's set up to get a considerably less funding than they have been in the past. But from the information you just said, special ed is not going to be categorically tied to like the charter system. It's going to be its own entity in terms of funding. So that pool of money won't be reduced by 30% as well. It would be available just as if that student was to go at a non-charter school.
Yeah, so great comment, great question. So the information that I shared with you, so special education lives in its own silo. And so it doesn't matter if your child attends a charter school, a non-public school, a private school, a traditional school, it all comes out of the same pot. And so while you use the word categorical, which shows you are well-versed in how this system works, special education is not really a categorical pot anymore. And so the governor is saying, historically, we've divided it up into all of these little ways. Right now, we have the opportunity to look at it as one big pot, but narrowly spent. And what he's saying is, let's do a study so that we can spend it in a way that's not so narrow, that we can give schools the opportunity to say, here's the list of services my child needs. I don't want to have to worry about costs. And so give us some different parameters in order to spend money for those kids that have more expensive services. You know, if the funding and oversight system continues to evolve the way that we're talking about it, that program would have much more flexibility in how they receive funding. And so if there were services that Abby needed that they don't currently offer, there would be a way for them to then work with that placing district or charter school to access different services and have the funding available. I mean, the state is in a great position right now financially. And so it's a great time to be thinking about, how are kids being served? And are there things that we should be thinking about differently as we think about how money's allocated to the folks that are providing the services? So the 3 years are split up into different sections. So the first year was, what is our system? Let's all make sure we understand it and talk about it the same way. And so that is, that study has been posted on the West Ed website. I'd be happy to send it to you. And then they're about to finish, what does our current, what are the problems with how funding is now allocated, and what oversight happens? Because one of the things we learned is that the money comes down to the local level, and then It's unclear. It's unclear how that money is tied to the outcomes that parents are saying they want for their kids. And so we need a cleaner line from the money that flows down to the local level and be held accountable to what parents are saying they want for their child. And so that's what we'll see, hopefully by the end. I would anticipate we'll see some proposals in September or October that will more closely reflect what it costs to serve kids with more complicated disabilities, and folks will see more money added into the system and then more flexibility on how they use it. So right now we can't sit in an IEP meeting and say, I want X curriculum to go into the general ed classroom to support that teacher. That pathway does not currently exist, but hopefully by the end of this year, this legislative year, we will see that. So Assemblymember Frazier has a child with a disability. He's also the liaison to the Advisory Commission on Special Ed. So he is the assembly representative that makes sure that our special ed guidance is, he's just very actively involved. So he has introduced this bill and has said, we had no idea what we were going to experience in COVID. Parents, families, school districts, charters had no idea what it was going to cost. And now that kids are starting to come back, we need to assess the learning loss. We need to hear from families what happened during this time. Hopefully they've all stayed connected, but we really need to sit down, redo the IEP or update the IEP, and then through that process, assess, are there funds that were put out in order to continue services, in order to fill those gaps that were created due to COVID? And there will be an application, if this bill goes through, there will be an application process at the Department of Ed that will allow LEAs for sure, so school entities for sure, to be reimbursed. And then hopefully we'll have I don't know if it'll happen in that process, that application process, or if a parent would go through their local school in order to be reimbursed. But as it goes through the fiscal committee, which will happen next week, some of those questions will get answered. So that bill is in its first house. It's in the assembly where it started. It'll go to the fiscal committee next week, and then it'll go to the second house, and then we'll see what changes happen there. It'll go back to the assembly just for a quick, checkbox. Everyone's still okay with it. And then it goes to the governor. So all that happens before January of next year. So it's not a quick process, but at least we'd have some answers in the next couple of months about whether or not we're going to see that COVID relief fund. And I think actually, if I remember correctly, this one was one of the bills that was expedited just because there are so many needs just resulting from COVID right now. There are lots of discussions happening right now about what's going to be offered during the summer. And I know that the governors sent out some updates today that I haven't even had a chance to read yet about summer options, and starting to collect information from districts and charters and non-public schools about what they want to have available. Mm-hmm. And making sure then that the money is there for them to do it. I think surveys to parents, if you haven't seen one yet, will probably be coming soon to say, would you be interested if this was made available? Would you be interested in sending your child? Yeah. But I think probably the most notable that you'll start hearing about is our world is siloed. So we have special ed money, we have traditional general ed money, we have mental health money, we have Department of Social Services money, we have probation money. Every one of these, actually 11 different systems, and every one of them is its own silo with its own case manager, with its own plan for a family or a child, and no intersection. And so the governor said, it's crazy. The governor in 2019 said the same thing. He said, these systems are working with the same child and there's no intersection. And so we're not using money efficiently. We're not using resources efficiently. And that poor family who has 11 different providers coming in and delivering something, but not coordinated with anybody else. It's insanity. So there has been a lot of work over the last couple of years that hopefully I think we'll see a recommendation in the fall to integrate mental health, behavioral health, which is one system, education, and health and human services. And so those three systems will come together, which for families, what that means is you don't have to engage with three different systems. You will sit at your IEP meeting, and hopefully on this new template, they will say, do you qualify for Medi-Cal, which is already there, but they have a little bit more questions coming. Do you have a case manager at Health and Human Services or mental health or behavioral health? What is their name? And then let's integrate those systems so that it's one family plan or case plan. So there is an effort. We've been very excited to see the administration prioritize integrating systems and leveraging money in a way that we have never seen before. The regional center is under the umbrella of Department of Social Services. It's a state agency, and the Family Empowerment Center is more of a resource, and they look a little different based on the county that they're in. So they might do advocacy work and engage and educate parents on funding issues. They might do technical assistance around, oh gosh, I can't even think of some of the examples right now, but I'd be happy to send you what the what the empowerment centers, where they are located and what their services are right now, and then what's being proposed. And it was a very small pilot that was put in place years ago and just never funded and never expanded. So those 14 areas that have an FEC have, they've been very successful, but, the argument is all kids, all families should have access to those resources. And so hopefully that will get funded this year for the first time. It's such a privilege to get to talk about, the funding and legislation, which I know is not that exciting. But at the same time, the reason I get to come and talk to folks like you is because you are creating the need for the system to change. And you are the ones putting that expectation out there that we do better as a state. And so I know that it's not hard. I know that it's hard, and I know it's not always welcomed in those IEP meetings. And I will say that it's, again, not because those folks are not interested in providing every service possible to your child, but that they just don't have the resources, the expertise, the funding available to do it in a way that your child needs. So I just want to thank you for pushing the conversation, continuing to push the conversation, and Eric and Kristen empowering families to continue to do that and giving them a place to talk about that is just exactly the work that I am excited to be a part of. So thank you for including me.